The Carolingian phase of the war, where we left off last time, ended around 1389, and at this point, France has reconquered most of France, except for some ports in Aquitaine in the southwest of France, and for Calais, which is in the north, and these ports were still in English hands. Just to let you know, this is the third video in the series, so be sure to check out the earlier two videos on the Hundred Years' War if you haven't already. So, what's the situation like in England? Well, Richard II, who is the second son of the Black Prince and grandson of Edward III, both the Black Prince and Edward III are now dead, sits on the English throne. But that quickly changes when Henry Bolingbroke, who's another grandson of Edward III, deposes Richard II and rules until 1413 as Henry IV. But he dies in 1413, and luckily he did have a child who he very originally named Henry, so Henry V was inaugurated in 1413 as the King of England. And what's going on in France? The King, Charles VI, descended into madness in 1392 and forces a regency council to rule in his stead. But this causes a lot of division in the French kingdom. Two clear factions who wanted to dominate the regency council emerged. The Armagnac faction under Louis of Valois, the Duke of Orleans, and the Burgundian faction under Philip the Bold, the Duke of Burgundy. The Duke of Burgundy, Philip, died and was replaced by his son, John the Fearless, the new Duke of Burgundy. But since John wasn't as close a relative to the king, he had a bit more trouble influencing politics. Philip, the old Duke of Burgundy, had been the king's uncle, but John was only a cousin now. On the other hand, Louis was brother to the king. So to try and solve this problem, John murdered Louis, and an outright civil war ensued from about 1410, and both sides clamoured for English support. But rather than enter on anyone's side, Henry V decided to make the most of the disarray in France for his own gain. He demanded that the French king acknowledged his territorial claims in France, and that he would eventually marry Charles's daughter, Catherine of Valois. But obviously this was too much to give up freely for the French, and so war it was. Henry V of England sailed to France with 10,500 men and laid siege to the town of Harfleur in Normandy. The town fell, albeit after a long period of resistance, meaning that a march on Paris the same year became unfeasible. Instead, Henry opted to march his army from Normandy up to English-occupied Calais, raiding as he went. But once again, reminiscent of Crécy, he was outmaneuvered by French forces and forced into an unfavourable pitched battle against a much larger French force north of the Somme River. But this was a mistake that previous French kings had also made, as they were overconfident of their chances on the battlefield against a numerically inferior English force. This event became known to history as the Battle of Agincourt. The backbone of the French army, the heavy cavalry, charged the English lines, but were utterly decimated by the English longbowmen, who proved to be a most valuable asset throughout this whole conflict. It was again a disaster for the French, where around 40% of the French nobility were killed, and so many prisoners were taken that they outnumbered the English forces themselves. Many of the Armagnac leaders were also killed, and Burgundy gained an upper hand in the French Civil War. Over the next 4 years, Henry set about reconquering Normandy for England, and eventually Normandy was in English hands for the first time in over 200 years. The town of Caen fell in 1417 and Rouen fell in 1419. As this was happening, the Burgundian faction in the French Civil War had taken control of Paris in 1418 and were now securely in pole position to win the Civil War. The two, that being Henry V of England and John the Fearless of Burgundy, made an alliance in 1419, and the next year in 1420 they met the French King Charles VI and signed the Treaty of Troyes, where Henry would marry Catherine of Valois and would become the new heir to the French throne. Charles VII, the son of Charles VI and original heir to the French throne, was declared illegitimate. Henry had beaten the king, but by no means was the 100 Years' War over. The French nobles in the south did not all support Henry as the new king, and neither did the now illegitimate Charles VII, who felt that the French crown should be his when his father died. Henry's brother, Thomas, the Duke of Clarence, was left in France to deal with the rest of the French kingdom. But at the Battle of Bourges, Thomas was killed while recklessly leading a bold assault into the heart of a French army. And this was a big deal because he was currently the heir to the English throne. This forced Henry to return to France in 1421, where he laid siege to the town of Meaux, which fell after a protracted siege. But at some point it seems that Henry became ill. Henry V withdrew to the castle at Vincennes and died on the 31st of August 1422, before the death of Charles VI of France 2 months later. So Henry V would never himself be a king of France. He left only his 9-month-old son, Henry VI, as heir to the English throne. This threw more questions over the Treaty of Troyes, which we will explore next time in the final episode of the 100 Years' War, so subscribe to catch that, and I will see you in the next one.